Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Good morning, wellness supporters. Yay, we're glad you're here. COVID uncovered what we have known for a long time, that physician well-being is critical if you want to avoid people quitting on you or if you want to avoid early retirement. I'm Rita Manfredi from George Washington University.
And I'm L.A. Alvarez. I'm the Director of Wellbeing at Stanford Emergency Medicine.
Dave Lee, University of Washington.
And you are in the right place. These are 5 indispensable articles that will help your understanding of physician well-being and help your practice.
All right, so I'm going first. So we know that in the last couple of years, talk about burnout, wellness has really crescendoed, but things have been going on in terms of research, development of this whole field of study for the last 3 decades. And this first article I picked mainly because it's a great Cliff Notes, a summary of what has been going on in the last 30 years. So if any of you are relatively new to the burnout wellness area, whether it's being on a committee, being the new director of a wellness committee, or just interested in this from a research standpoint, I highly recommend reading this because in just one article, you will catch up on everything that has happened in the last 30 years. Oh, okay. So I just want to highlight one graphic that's important in this paper, and they kind of talk about the history of all of this into 3 main eras. The first one was the era of distress, and this was really pre-2005. This is the period when physicians were mostly men. They had spouses at home, so work balance issues really wasn't a thing. You went through medical school, residency, kind of by attrition. Like there was no worry about work-life balance, sleep, duty hours. None of that really was kind of a big thing. At the same time, EHR was not a main issue throughout most of the hospitals in the country, right? So you kind of did your own thing. Physicians had a lot of autonomy. On the one hand, that was good, but on the other hand, when things went wrong, the physician really was the person who was kind of like, why did that happen? You were kind of considered all-knowing, all sort of omnipotent, and if anything were to happen, it was really blamed on the individual. So that was kind of the era of distress. And I should also mention that when issues of distress did come up, when you mentioned that you were burnt out or depressed or whatever, you were kind of labeled sort of weak as opposed to, hey, maybe there are system issues that are at play. So that was the era of distress. Now, where we are now is really well-being 1.0. So this is 2005 to about now. And the main issues here, the big differences were now, there's gender parity in medical schools. Most physicians are in dual sort of career households, so work-life balance really came to the forefront. At the same time, lots of hospitals have consolidated. Most physicians are now employees, right? And we kind of have to answer to a lot of metrics that weren't there before. There's the HR everywhere. We have to care about patient quality, stroke metrics, SEMI metrics, all that stuff. None of that was really there before. And this is now where you get the misalignment. Like, did I go to med school to really care about Press Ganey scores? No, but that's what my boss cares about, right? At the same time, you started having some new studies that come out of Medscape and the sort of throwaway journals about burnout in med school, residents, faculty, and then there's a lot of robust research now showing like burnout is related to quality, to patient satisfaction, to suicidality, alcohol, all that stuff. So that is sort of where we are now. What this article then highlights is where are we going from now? So that's well-being 2.0. And the big thing there is, in the last couple of years, the WHO formally recognized burnout as an occupational phenomenon that is separate from depression. That only happened, I think, 2019 or something. At the same time, there was that huge landmark paper that came out of the National Academy of Medicine, right, focused on wellness. And I feel like where we are now is kind of where the error movement, the quality movement was when that report came out in the 90s to err is human. So that happened, I think, in the 90s, and now every place has a safety officer, every place has a QA, QI committee. That took years to happen, and it was, I think, because of things like that paper. So this current paper, the National Academy of Medicine, the wellness thing that came out recently, I think is where we are now in the next 10 years. It will be commonplace for every place to have a wellness committee, a director of wellness, a chief wellness officer. So that's kind of where things are happening and going in the future.
Maybe. in
Maybe,
10 years. Maybe at the 9.5 year, everybody will get it together.
Yeah.
But well-being 101 was sort of us versus them. And this well-being now 2.0 is more like us working with them. At least that's where we're hoping to go. Wouldn't you say that, Dave?
Oh yeah, totally. That's the goal.
I think that idea of a shared responsibility of working with the leadership as opposed to blaming the system all the time. I mean, most of us, many of us, the idea that the system is causing the burnout will resonate, right? Yeah. And at the same time, trying to just like peg it as like they need to fix it without us working with the leadership, without working with the system, it's actually just not realistic. And in addition, there's this idea that in well-being 1.0 or even in the era of distress, we were thought of as like superheroes, that we can do anything, right? But the problem with that is that when we're tired, right, because we're just humans, when we're hungry, when we're being blamed for all these things and we feel guilty, the shame, we're expected to just deal with it. Versus well-being 2.0, we have to just understand that actually, just like you, just like anybody else, just like our patients, we're also human beings. And we also get tired, and we're also susceptible to the many things that are distressing our patients.
Yeah. So for the sake of time, so I just want to highlight again why we chose this article as a group. So this is a really, really great big picture sort of overview of where have we been, where are we now, and where are we going, and it summarizes in a Cliff Notes concise version of what's been going on in the last 30 years. So I highly recommend reading it.
I'll just quickly jump into, so Dave mentioned Chief Wellness Officer. So there's this evolving role of Chief Wellness Officer. So at Stanford, we have the first Chief Wellness Officer that was ever created. And I can tell you it works well for us. Like every other week, I have a meeting with the Chief Wellness Officer because there's Director of Wellbeings in each of the departments. And so a lot of the work that we're doing is more centralized. I understand as well that that's not the case in many institutions. And so this article highlights the differences in the progression of Chief Wellness Officers across the country. Some people might even argue that you don't need yet another person to take care of well-being because, again, it's a systems issue. I would argue, again, coming from a place where we do have a Chief Wellness Officer, it's helpful to have somebody that their job is only to focus on the well-being of the physicians as opposed to trying to catch up on cleanups, trying to make sure that the quality is being done. So my role in the department is specifically opining on things like, hey, how is this going to affect the physicians, the end users? So the paper highlights this table, which is actually modeled from the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, and it talks about this idea, the concept of the stress continuum. So you're either like the staff response could be they're ready all the way to they're ill when they're really suffering from moral distress and severe. I'll just cut to the punchline here. There's a few things here that can be triggering, like ill, for instance. I think that it's there for a reason because it's humanizing physicians. We are humans, and so we also can get ill, and we have to account for ways to manage that, including mental health. And as you know, this month is Mental Health Awareness Month. I'm just going to briefly mention the 7 C's of psychological first aid, also being used by the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. And the idea is that these are ways that you can, at least from the Chief Wellness Officer's perspective, they would work with their institution, the people within the institution. So do they need to coordinate some referrals for mental health support? Do they need to cover, so during the pandemic, like when I got COVID in December, WellMD sent me somebody who called me, check in with me. They asked me, hey, do you need a hotel to be isolated so you can be safe from your family? So things like that were able to be provided. And then like 2 weeks later, I get like a gift basket to just remind you that, hey, like we know that you're like struggling with this. Like here's something to just remember that you can also eat something nice. So in summary, there's a evolution of Chief Wellness Officers. You'll see this over the next decade as well in terms of their roles in your institutions, how you can leverage the Chief Wellness Officer, and how you can even like create a Chief Wellness Officer in your program if that's something that your program is interested in. I would be remiss if we don't add anything about physician suicide because of the staggering impacts of the pandemic to our mental health. This article is a non-EM study. It's actually a perspective piece on the increased risk of physician suicide. And I'll just give you some bullet points here. The high-risk populations that they pointed out were female physicians. And in looking at the article, they referenced the original paper, and really what they found is that there's a lot more inequities and expectations for women in medicine. And that adds to that distress that people are experiencing, especially those who have caregiving responsibilities. Working in rural areas, what they found were actually men struggled more than women in terms of trying to seek mental health. If you are, let's say, in the middle of nowhere, you probably know all like the mental health resources there, unless you're going like online. And so men were less likely to seek mental health support. And then working in under-resourced practices just adds to that concept of moral injury, right? You want to do something right for your patients, and yet there's this betrayal, number one, from the system. You don't have PPE, you don't have the ventilator, and also you're opting not to do the right thing. I'm not going to intubate this patient because XYZ, when pre-pandemic you would have easily intubated them. Those series of betrayals add to this moral injury that has been associated with physician suicide. And then as a reminder, just a couple of months ago, this has been passed with the Lorna Breen Healthcare Provider Protection Act, which among many things that it's done is to normalize that we should seek mental health support, just like we get like screening for like physical health. And also that there's research being done and advocacy to make sure that we minimize the stigma for getting mental health support.
That's great. This is an older article, but it is really key. It's the 2017 Institute for Healthcare Improvement looked at this very comprehensive white paper that has to do with improving joy in the system. So if you haven't taken time to look at it, it's IHI.org. And the way they conducted it was the usual way, literature scans, they did interviews, but the most important thing they did that I think was they went to non-medical organizations, looked at what they were doing, and provided examples throughout the paper. So if you're trying to convince somebody in your organization what needs to be done, you can use these examples. And then what they did is they put together just 4 very easy steps of how to do this. And Dr. Liu is going to talk a little bit, expand these steps in the next article. But just really, really simply to go through it, you start with just asking your staff what matters to them, what makes a good day, and you listen. You don't do the talking, you listen to them. And then you find out what barriers there are in their institution, in their department. What are the impediments to joy in work? And, there's a good example, the University of Michigan Critical Intensive Care Unit got together their nurses, their scribes, and their fellows, cardiology fellows. They sat them down and said, hey, how can we figure out what gives you joy in work? And they all sat down there, and everyone got a chance to give their opinion, which is really important. The next step is you got to commit to a systems approach, and that means that creating joy in the organization has to start at the top with the leaders, and then it trickles down to your managers, and it finally gets to us in the trenches at the work unit level. And so it's everybody's responsibility to have joy in work. And let me tell you, we all know there's not a lot of joy in work right now. But when you have this joy in work, this leads to improving the metrics that the leaders are interested in. And what are those metrics? Patient safety, patient satisfaction, and that overall improves your quality of care and everybody's satisfaction. So how do you do this? Well, the American Association of Critical Care Nurses say, hey, you got to have a wellness champion. So in your organization, wherever you are, in your department, you really have to have a wellness champion. If you don't, maybe it's time to think about you might being it. And then the last thing is, you want to make all these changes, but if you don't measure it, you can't improve it. And that's from Peter Drucker, a very famous economist. And I just want to give one last quick example, and that was at the University of Virginia School of Nursing. We talked about this in a talk I was just in, that all the people felt really encumbered by having to answer emails during your time off. Does that ring a bell to anybody? Anyways, what they did is they did a little pilot. They said, okay, just a few nurses, we're going to stop sending you emails during your time off. Well, the benefits were immediately evident. And they extended it to the entire School of Nursing. And in a post-survey, they found that 80% of the respondents said, hey, yeah, you really made a difference in respecting my personal time. So making those changes at the system level can definitely impact you at the individual level. So why is this article important? There's got to be a paradigm change. Those are the 4 steps that leaders can take, and read those examples in the appendix.
All right, we just have a couple of minutes left, but I just want to highlight the 5th and last article that we picked. So we picked this just because how do you do this, right? So how do you do what Rita just said? How do you do this from an organizational standpoint, institutional standpoint? And this article is important because it gives you an actual blueprint of how do you actually go about do this? What are the things you have to consider? And this article is especially useful, and it's targeted towards CMOs, CWOs, or people who are running their wellness committee or on a wellness committee. So I highly recommend this article because it gives you a beautiful blueprint of how to do it so you're not reinventing the wheel. I won't belabor the points of the graphic here, but it just shows you, I just want to highlight that this article gives you a lot of evidence-based strategies on how to do this, and it gives you real-life examples from multiple institutions. And the one I want to highlight you may have heard of before was the Getting Rid of Stupid Stuff paper. So that came out, I think, in 2016 or something out of the University of Hawaii. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's from the New England Journal. We didn't include it because it's pretty old, but if you just Google or PubMed, Getting Rid of Stupid Stuff, it was an initiative done at the University of Hawaii where they did a system intervention where they asked all the nurses, physicians, what are the stupid things in your daily work life that you wish you could get rid of? They submitted all these things. A third of them they realized couldn't be changed because of JCO, Medicare, Medicaid reasons. Another third, it was just too hard. But they were found that after a course of a year, they were able to fix about a third of these hundreds and hundreds of complaints. And that project alone did much more for wellness for everybody in the institution rather than anything else they could have done. So that's just a concrete example that these authors mentioned. There are other things that are happening at Stanford, at Brigham. So I highly recommend this article for that reason. And the last thing,
access to the slides.
yeah, the last thing I want to mention is I still refer to this when I'm about to do a project with my institution at with my wellness committee, just because you sometimes forget, you're deep in the weeds. How do we get this issue done? This gives you a big picture of like, who are the stakeholders? Who do you have to consider? What do you have to do? How do you measure? Which instrument do you use? How do you measure a response? So this is a great blueprint that just walks you through and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So highly recommend this article.
So we're at time. We're happy to answer questions in the back so that the speaker that's coming in can set up for their next talk. Thank you so much for your time.